to be able to figure out what indeed is this accomplishment and what exactly happens at the giving of a Torah that did not happen before the giving of a Torah, even to the patriarchs and the tribes and descendants who kept the Torah. So the entry point is going to be a passage of the Talmud about a great sage named Rav Yosef and how he celebrated and how he defined the holiday. Actually, a strange definition. But when we analyze the definition of Rav Yosef, that will get us to we'll be able to explore the deeper meaning and core of what happens on the holiday and understand what we're experiencing and therefore re-experiencing every year, including this year. Okay, so that's the background. It's a little bit long. We're probably not going to finish the whole thing today, but I don't know if we have to because there's different layers and there's different points. Like at the end, there's a whole connection of why this idea was explained specifically through Rav Yosef. So there's so many layers. Hopefully we'll get a full point even just today. Like this, we'll be able to have start the holiday with a complete idea. So I'm just going to share in the chat. I'll share the link to the English translation. And I'm also going to share the screen. So whatever is more convenient is good. Okay, here we go. Are we in the game? No, we're not in the game.
Yep, you are.
I'm in the game. I'm sharing it. Oh,
yeah.
Usually I get like a yellow thing. Yeah, I'm sharing it. Interesting. Okay, fine. Okay, fine. Okay, so we're going to start with like I said, the surprising Talmudic passage where this great sage Rav Yosef defines the day of Shavuot. And that would be the segue to figure out what is the definition of the day, because on the face of it, the definition that he offers is strange at best. Okay. One of the sayings of our rabbis, which demonstrates the great quality of Matan Torah, which is the giving of the Torah, appears in Tractate Pesachim. Tractate Pesachim is the tractate that discusses the laws of Passover. Laws, history, everything else about Passover. Says the Talmud, on the day of Shavuot, Shavuos is the Ashkenazi pronunciation, day of Shavuot, Rav Yosef would say, prepare for me a third-born calf. Third-born calf was considered the best meat you can get. Third-born calf. The first one is not as tasty as the third one. Why? The third one, at the third one, let's say they have to have the footnote here. Okay, so the third calf by its mother, alternative translations in its third year, or third grown, i.e. one that has reached a third of its full growth. According to all translations, such a calf was regarded as being especially choice. Okay, so is it the third one born, or it's one that's 3 years old, or a third of its growth? The different opinions what that means. The bottom line is he wants a good piece of meat. I guess he never got the memo that on Shavuot we eat cheesecake. So he wants to have good meat, good calf meat. Why? What's so special about this day? What's so special about this day? Says Rabbi Yosef, saying, if not for the influence of this day, how many Yosefs are there in the marketplace? That's what he says. So now imagine I stop you in the street and I say, we're celebrating Shavuot. Define for me, please, in a soundbite, right? It's the TikTok age. You have to speak under what? I don't know what the limit of TikTok is. 30 seconds. You have a certain amount. Give me a clip of what's the holiday of Shavuot. How would you define the celebration of the getting of the Torah? So Rav Yosef says, if not for this day, there would be so many of me in the marketplace. In other words, I wouldn't be distinguished. I wouldn't be different. And that's why I'm so happy. I'm so happy, and that's why I celebrate. And that's why I celebrate this holiday. And not only I celebrate it, but I celebrate it with good meat, right? The third-born calf, whatever that means, he wants the best meat in the shop. Okay, very strange passage. We have so many questions, but I'll offer a few of the questions, or read a few of the questions, and then we'll go to the answer. Among the many questions that this statement invites, what did Rav Yosef mean by the use of the explanation this day? by making this statement, Rav Yosef meant that he distinguished himself from other people because he studied Torah, as Rashi explains. Why does he say that this obliquely, if not for this day, and not clearly, if not for the Torah, or something to that effect? He says, if not for this day, why don't you say, if not for the Torah? Furthermore, Rav Yosef's intention was to emphasize the virtue of Torah study. Yet Torah study is not connected specifically to this day, the day of the giving of the Torah. For even before the giving of the Torah on the 6th of Sivan, the Jewish people learned Torah, as the rabbis say. This is a quote from, 7, Yoma, Tractate the Talmud. Since the days of our ancestors, they, the Jewish people, were not without the yeshiva. When they lived in Egypt, they had a yeshiva. Avram was an elder and sat learning in yeshiva. Patriarchs taught their children the Torah. The children taught it to the tribes, and the tribes to their children. Even when the Jews went to Egypt, they always had a center of Torah study. So in other words, that's the question. Why does Rav Yosef connect the virtue of Torah study with this day? You could say we've got the commandments. Say it's amazing day, Shavuot. We got the 10 commandments. What a wonderful soundbite. You can even put it on your Facebook status. Okay, it's amazing. We got the Torah, we got the commandments. But to say this, if not for this day, I would be like everybody else. And Rashi says that means I would not be distinguished because I didn't study Torah. Torah, we always had the Torah. So that's the question. Additionally, we need to clarify, what does the term the influence of this day add? It would have sufficed for Rav Yosef to have said, if not for this day. If you look at the text in the Talmud, it says, if not for the influence of this day, how many Yosefs were there in the marketplace? We're going to make a big deal about this. It's not just a detail. But when we get to the answer, this will be the whole point here. He doesn't say, if not for this day. He says, if not for the influence of this day. He's celebrating not this day, but the influence of this day. Okay, so that's the questions. I'm sure there are many more questions here because that's the style that I was writing. Maybe we should go. Yeah, we'll read another few questions. Why not? Okay, let's go to 3. More questions. Additional nuances in Rav Yosef's statements. Why did he ask how many Yosefs are there and not just how many people? Why is the name Yosef relevant to the context of discussing Rav Yosef's virtues? And Rashi emphasizes further, there are a number of people in the marketplace whose names are Yosef. Question 1. Question 2, what does Rashi intend to add by saying in the marketplace, as opposed to just saying how many Yosefs are there? Okay, so we're looking now at the nuance of this statement. So in other words, what happens? Rabbi Yosef says, it's the holiday of Shavuot. Do me a favor, prepare good meat for me. Why? Because I'm so excited. What happened on Shavuot? If not for the influence of this day, how many Yosefs would there be in the marketplace? So if you notice, we're actually attacking and questioning each segment of this short statement, right? We're almost asking on every single word. Right? So what does it mean if not for the influence of this day? Say if not for this day, or say if not for the Torah. What does it mean if not for the influence of this day? What does it mean the influence of this day? Second of all, then he says, if not for this day, how many Yosefs would be in the marketplace? His name was Yosef. You should have said, how many people were there are there? And now I'm unique because I study Torah. But why this using of the terms, how many Yosefs are there in the marketplace? So not very big questions. When you get to the answer, well, this entire statement is understood in a deeper light. Plus, we'll understand, which is why we're really here. We're going to understand what is the essence of the essence of the holiday. So to get to the essence of the holiday, I'm first going to say it in short by heart, and then we're going to read it inside to see in the Rebbe's words. So it's actually based on a medrash. The medrash says like this. The medrash says, it's quoted in Rashi. The medrash says, if you want to understand what happened at the giving of the Torah, because the actual words of the Torah is Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. God descended on Mount Sinai. In other words, it's not just that God told us the 10 commandments or communicated the 10 commandments, but God descended onto Mount Sinai. So what does that mean? So you have an interesting medrash. The medrash says as follows. There's a parable. Once upon a time, there was a king who made a decree. The decree was that the people of Syria should not go to Rome, and the people of Rome should not go to Syria. In other words, they build a wall. You can't cross the border. At some point, he says, you know what? He canceled this decree. And he said the people of Rome should come down to Syria. The people of Syria should go up to Rome. That's the metaphor. That's the metaphor. Then the Medrash explains. So too, when God created the world, he said, the heavens are for God and the earth is for the human beings. It's a quote from King David's book of Psalms. Hashamayim, we say it on Hallel. We said it yesterday on Hallel. Hashamayim shamayim Hashem. The heavens are heavens for God, and the earth was given to humans. So there's a divide, which means just like the people of Rome in the metaphor stay in Rome, the people in Syria remain in Syria. So God remains in the heaven, and the people remain on earth. Says the Medrash, when the Torah was given, the decree was nullified. The people from the heaven, the people from God descends on Mount Sinai, and the people ascend to the heaven. And the Medrash quotes the verse. The verse says, God descended on Mount Sinai, and to Moshe, who represents the Jewish people, God said, Alei Elokim, ascend to God. That's the Medrash. Wonderful Medrash. The Hasidic interpretation now is going to go deep. And the Hasidic interpretation says like this. Yes, of course, we read in the literature, in the Medrash, etc., that the patriarchs kept the Torah. But the Torah that they kept was completely different because that was pre-decree. We, after the giving of the Torah, we are post-decree. What does it mean, pre-decree, post-decree? When we do a mitzvah, the actual physical material of the world is transformed and the physical object becomes holy. So if you take the hide of the animal and you write the Shema on it and you put it on your door, it becomes a mezuzah. It's not just a symbol of something holy, but the actual parchment has been transformed. And therefore, if you want to, if you finish using it, if it's ruined, you can't throw it in the garbage because it has an innate holiness. And therefore, it has to be treated with respect and has to be buried. But the same is true about any mitzvah. Any mitzvah that you do post the giving of the Torah, now that God comes down onto earth and the earth can go up to God, so the physical material of the world could be transformed. By contrast, if you look at the commandments that the patriarchs fulfilled, so assuming they fulfilled the commandments, they did a physical commandment, the physical object was not transformed. So there's a famous Medrash, it's actually the Zohar. The Zohar says that if you look at the book in Genesis, you have the stories of Jacob. And Jacob, we have a lot of discussion of how he took care of the sheep of Laban, his father-in-law. And when he put the sheep, he put sticks in front of them, different colored sticks, in order to produce different color offsprings, and on and on and on at great length. So the Medrash says, what the Zohar says, which is the mystical part of Judaism, that whatever we accomplish through our putting on tefillin, Jacob accomplished through his work with those sticks. Okay, what's the difference between Jacob and us? That when Jacob finished using the sticks, he can throw them into the garbage. When we finish putting on tefillin, we can't throw it into the garbage. Why? Because when we do a mitzvah, the physical world has been transformed, the physical material has been transformed. When the patriarchs did the mitzvah before the giving of the Torah, the physical material has not been transformed. It may be a symbol of something spiritual, but it itself does not become holy. Not because we're greater than the sages. Not because we're greater than the patriarchs. That's not the reason. The reason is because there was a divide. Go back to the metaphor. There was a decree. There was a border. You can't go from Syria to Rome. You can't go from earth to heaven or from heaven to earth. There was a divide between heaven and earth. There's a divide between holiness and material objects, material world. What happens and what's the big idea at Sinai? So again, now I have a little bit more insight. You stop me in the street and you say, what happened at Shavuot? What happened when we got the Torah? I can't say, we got the Torah. It's not completely accurate. It's true, but it's not completely accurate because we got the Torah, but we already had some of it information or most of the information before. So what really happened? What's the big novelty that happened specifically at the giving of the Torah that did not happen before, that the patriarchs did not have? The answer is the nullification of the divide. The divide between Syria and Rome, which is the metaphor for the divide between heaven and earth, has been banished and been obliterated. And now God comes down into the physical world, and the physical world can be elevated to God. So now when we do a mitzvah, the object has been transformed. So we're going to read that inside in the essay. But before we do that, I'll take Vicky's question, and then I'm going to give a little bit more insight, and then we'll read it inside. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I don't know if that was addressed in the questions, but the first question that comes to mind, why specifically he asked for meat? Were the kosher laws was done before the Torah was given, or after, or together?
So the kosher laws, the commandment to the kosher laws are at Sinai, but presumably at least some of the Jews knew about it before and kept it before. But it's I'll give you a I don't know if the Rebbe mentions it here. I think he does, but I don't know if he doesn't. He doesn't do it at great length. Other essays, he does this at great length. It's a very strange concept. I'm so happy that I got the Torah, so I'm going to eat meat. Only Jews can say a statement like that, right? Because I would expect to say, I'm so happy that I got the Torah, so I'm going to come all night and study Torah, which we do as well. But I'm so happy that I got the Torah, so I'm going to eat meat. Okay? Now I'll tell you even more. There is a concept, we're going to do a JLI about it in next spring. There's a concept called Tanit Chalom. We're talking about dreams, the Kabbalah of dreams. So that's a subject for itself. But there's a concept called the fast of a dream. So the notion is as follows. The notion is, if I wake up and I have a bad dream, and I'm worried about this bad dream, I'm worried about the consequences, assuming I have what to worry about, that's going to be the subject of the JLI. Does dreams mean anything? But assuming this dream is meaningful, and I'm very worried about the content of the dream. So in the times of the Talmud, people would want to repent. So they would fast the morning after they had a bad dream, or the day after they had a bad dream. And it's a serious thing because you can't postpone it. It has to be the next day. So now the question is, could you fast because of a dream on Shabbat? What do you think? Yes or no? Shabbat is a mitzvah to eat. But I'm also worried that I may have a bad dream. I'm worried about the outcome. So I want to fast. So I think Elisa said no, right? You said no?
Right.
No fasting. The law is fascinating. The law is you are allowed to fast a fast of a dream on Shabbat, but you committed another sin because you didn't eat on Shabbat, which is a day of pleasure. So you can fast on Shabbat, but then you have to fast another time during the week to atone for the fact that you fasted on Shabbat. Only Jews can come up with this solution. Why am I telling this to you? Because there's only one day a year where you're not allowed to fast for whatever reason, even for a bad dream. What is that? Shavuot. We got the Torah, there is no fasting. You can fast on Shabbat. You cannot fast on Shavuot. Why? So Rashi explains, you have to show that you're happy that you got the Torah. Imagine we got the Torah. I said, oh, I'm fasting. I'm in mourning today. That would maybe people think you're not happy you got the Torah. So we must demonstrate that we actually are happy that we got the Torah. Okay, so all this was parenthetic. My point is this. My point is, if what we're saying is correct, and it is, if what we're saying is correct, the whole purpose of the Torah is a whole purpose of the giving of a Torah is to transform the physical world. Then whatever we're going to celebrate Shavuot has to have an expression in the physical world, because that's the whole theme of the Torah. So what are you going to say? I'm celebrating the fact that the Torah was given, so now I could transform the physical world, and I'm going to celebrate it by thinking Torah, thinking ideas. You're still in heaven. You're stuck in heaven. You missed the boat. You missed the point, right? The whole point is that we could transform the physical world. So it has to find expression in the physical world. And that's why he chooses meat, because in those days, because the Talmud says joy is with meat. Now, you may have heard, it's true, you may have heard that on Shavuot we eat dairy, okay? Now, so I'm going to shut off the recording for this because I may be disbarred for saying this. It's heresy. But there's also an obligation to eat meat on Shavuot, even though in Greenwich, meat is banned for 48 hours. But you have to eat meat on Shavuot because it's a holiday. So the mitzvah to eat dairy, the custom, not a mitzvah, the custom to eat dairy is an addition. So you have to first eat dairy, then you have to wait, and then you have to eat meat. That's what we did growing up. I used to go to my grandmother's house on President Street, and we used to have cheese blintzes, and then we would wait an hour and then have meat. But how much can you eat? So some people drop the meat, but it's an obligation to eat meat because it's the holiday, unless you don't like meat. If you don't like meat, you don't have to eat meat. Fine. Which is by the way, going back to, that's the rationale why you're allowed to fast on Shabbat. Going back to Elisa's point, why do I allow to fast on Shabbat? Because Shabbat is for pleasure. If I eat the morning after I had a bad dream, I have no pleasure, right? So the purpose is not the food. The purpose is the pleasure. So most people get pleasure from eating. So you honor Shabbat by eating. But for me, eating would be painful. so I don't eat. Okay, but that doesn't work on Shavuot, because Shavuot, the whole purpose of Shavuot is to demonstrate, like Rashi says, demonstrate that you're happy that the Torah was given, but you have to demonstrate it in a physical form by eating physical food, because that's the theme of the day. The theme of the day is, the theme of the day would be to influence the physical world. So one has to find expression by eating physical food. Okay, that was a long answer. I went off on a tangent, but I can't hold it in because this is such an important theme in the Hasidic literature of Shavuot. You must eat. You must eat. Why? Like your grandmother's telling you have to eat because she's afraid that the Jews are not going to have food tomorrow. But it's a real thing. You're not allowed to fast the one day a year. A trivia question. What's the one day of year that you're not allowed to fast? It's only Shavuot. There's no other day where you're not allowed to fast. There are many days the Talmud says you're not allowed to fast, but the fasting for a dream overrides all those days.
So they did eat meat on Shavuot, and it was kosher, right?
Yeah. This is Rav Yosef. This is Talmudic times, Vicky. This is not the first year. This story of Rav Yosef saying, "How many prepare for me a nice piece of meat because if not for this day, how many Josephs were there in the marketplace?" This story occurs. He's an Amorai. This story occurs 1,500 years after the Torah was given, right? That what you're alluding to is one of the reasons why we eat dairy. By the way, nobody knows why we eat dairy. In other words, there's so many reasons. But if you have so many reasons, it's because no one knows the reason. But one of the reasons were because they did not have time to prepare kosher meat. That's one of the reasons. It's not the most convincing reason, but it's one of the reasons. But in any case, but that doesn't apply here because we're talking about 1,500 years later in the story of Rabbi Yosef. Okay, so what did we say so far? Just to summarize, we summarized and we said that the big thing that happened on Shavuot is that it's not that we got the Torah and the mitzvot. The patriarchs also had the ideas of the Torah, and they also did certain things similar to the way we do it. But it's much more than that. So it's not that's just now we have more commandments, so more people do the commandments. That's just that's just a quantitative increase. But really, there's a qualitative increase. What's the qualitative increase? The qualitative increase is that before the giving of the Torah, before the Torah was given, you can do anything you want in the physical world, but the physical material doesn't become holy. Now the physical material becomes holy. You put a mezuzah on the door. You eat matzah. Whatever you're going to do, you give charity. Whatever you're going to do, the physical object of that mitzvah becomes transformed, which represents the purpose of creation to transform the physical world, which was impossible before the Torah was given because the divide between heaven and earth, between physical and spiritual, was absolute. And what happens at the giving of a Torah is that the decree that divides Rome and Syria, that divides heaven and earth, was divided. It's funny because in Hebrew, the word decree comes from the word division. Gezerah, the gzor is the cut, right? So there was a decree that was literally a cut between heaven and earth, and that cut is transformed. Okay, so that's the big idea. We're going to read it inside, and once we explain this, we'll explain everything else from Rav Yosef's statement, provided we have time. But before that, I want to say one more thing. In the 19th century, was it the 19th century? Yeah, the 19th century in the yeshivas of Eastern Europe, they were a little bit influenced by the different philosophies floating around Eastern Europe at the time, and it crept into the study halls as well. So the study halls, the yeshiva also started thinking more when they started studying the Talmud. They started thinking not just about the law, but also the philosophy of the law. And they come up with different ideas and different forms of analysis that were actually relatively new for Torah study. And one is called a chakira. Chakira is basically, the translation is an investigation, but it's really an analysis. And the analysis is, for this to work, you have to look at a law and you have to present two possibilities. And there has to be ramification between those two possibilities. And then based on these two possibilities, you get insight into what is the core and what's the philosophy of the law. So I'm going to, instead of talking about it, I'll give you an example, but the example the case in point is the example we want to talk about. When you say, I am not allowed to eat something, okay, whatever, something is not kosher, I can't eat something. Or when you say, I have an obligation, okay, let's do it, prohibition is better. When you say, I cannot eat something, so what are we saying? Are we saying the commandment is upon the person, I am not allowed to eat it? Or do you say, but the object itself is neutral? In other words, God tells me, you don't eat pork. What's wrong with pork? Nothing. The obligation is upon me. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that the obligation is because the object itself is problematic. So in the language of the yeshivas, they talk about gavra or cheftza, which is Aramaic for person or object. So the Torah says don't eat pork. Is it the person or is it the object? Is it I shouldn't eat it, but the object is neutral? Or is it I shouldn't eat it because the object itself is problematic? Now the answer is it depends, right? So there's certain laws that it's only the person, and one of the ways to tell is the prohibition just for me or is it for everybody? So for example, next week's parsha we're going to learn about the Nazirite. The Nazirite is a person who makes an oath he's not going to drink wine and have other restrictions. At that point, the wine is still kosher. How do I know? Everybody else can drink the wine, right? So that's pretty clear that when it comes to the Nazir, the prohibition against drinking the wine is upon the person. It's not upon the wine. The wine itself is neutral. But other commandments that are universal are understood to be the object itself is problematic. That's called gavra and cheftza, the person of the thing. Similarly is what we're saying here before the giving of the Torah and after the giving of the Torah. Before the giving of the Torah, if Abraham did a mitzvah, it's because he wanted to do it or he was commanded to do it, but it was on the person. It wasn't on the thing. Because the thing was irrelevant. The thing wasn't holy. The thing was not affected by the Torah. Once the Torah was given, what happens now is that the object itself is in the game. The object itself is either positive or negative, could be elevated, could be transformed. And that is the big idea. And hopefully that itself is already enough of an idea to part ways today. Then it will give us enough inspiration for the holiday. But if we have a few more minutes, we'll read it inside. And then hopefully we'll get to, maybe I'll say it by heart, we'll get to we'll have time to come back to Rav Yosef's statement and try to clarify it, but we'll see if we get there. But even if we don't, this concept itself is really the core concept that I wanted to get to. So any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, we proceed to read this idea inside in the translated essay by the essay of the Rebbe translated into English. So we'll get more of a flavor. Okay, here we go. Oh, go ahead, Vicky.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I had a follow-up to my first question. So is that the fact that now we can make meat kosher kind of in line with that same idea? That's what my question was.
Not necessarily, because let's assume that before the giving of the Torah, the patriarchs kept kosher. So Abraham, when the three guests came to his house, Abraham told his son, the lad, to go and prepare the meat. Okay? No, Abraham himself went to prepare the meat. Okay? Let's assume Abraham kept kosher. He slaughtered the meat properly. Okay? But what we're saying is his kosher meat and our kosher meat are two different stories. Why? Because when he kept kosher, it was upon him. In other words, it says he decided to do this. God told him, he felt that for him, he should eat the meat in a certain way, but it was all about him. The obligation is upon him. What we're saying is if you prepare the meat, once the Torah was given, but the cow is the same cow, it makes no difference to the cow. But if you say, after the giving of the Torah, if you prepare meat in a kosher way, the meat itself has a certain measure of holiness. This meat itself has a certain measure of that holiness imparted to it by the mitzvah. So in other words, we could even say Abraham could have kept the same mitzvah before, but it meant a totally different thing. And if you talk about what's the purpose of creation, the purpose of creation is to transform the physical world. So Abraham is a preparation at best to get the person in the mode of keeping the Torah. The patriarchs are merely a preparation, but the actual work of transforming the world, the physical material of the world, can only start once the Torah was given, can only start once the separation and divide between heaven and earth was nullified and taken down, which that happened on the giving of the Torah. So I guess eating the meat is a symbol of what's happening now, which is when we prepare the meat in the way prescribed in the Torah, the physical meat itself retains a certain degree of holiness.
Thank you. That's what the thing I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. And again, I'm going to read here. We'll see how fast we go. Don't hesitate to stop me and ask questions. I'm just going at my own pace, but I'm just going, Tell me I'm going too fast or too slow. It's all good. Here we go. The explanation. Okay, I just want to point out that they put in a title here. This is not from the Rebbe. The translators put in the title Gavran Chefza, which is person or object, right? But if you ever went to yeshiva, everyone knows Gavran Chefza is that question of does the prohibition or does the mitzvah apply to the person or does it apply to the object? We actually talked about this, I think. Did we talk about it a few weeks ago when we talked about the new grain? I think we spoke about it. If it's upon the person, it's universal. It's everywhere. If it's on the object, it's only in Israel. We talked about the seeds, okay, of the produce of Israel, but that's another story. Okay. So as mentioned above in section 1, our rabbis point out that the Torah was learned even before Matan Torah, even before the giving of the Torah. Similarly, they said regarding mitzvah observance, the sages say Abraham fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given. Understood simply then, the difference between Torah study and fulfilling mitzvot before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, and after Matan Torah is as follows. Before Matan Torah, mitzvot were fulfilled voluntarily, as one who was not commanded to do a mitzvah and still performed it. After Matan Torah, it became mandatory for the Jewish people in the manner of one who has been commanded and performs it. So that's the before you get to the Hasidic commentary, which I presented earlier, had you not known this, so you say, what's the difference between Abraham and us? So we say, well, Abraham fulfilled the whole Torah, but he did so voluntarily. Nobody ever told him that he has to. We do the mitzvah because we were commanded. And we'll see later that there's an advantage to be commanded. The advantage of one who is commanded and performs it after the giving of the Torah is not only regarding the person who performs the mitzvah, that he receives a greater reward or the like, but also, and primarily, there is an advantage with respect to the object with which the mitzvah is performed. And now here's we get to the point. Before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, a person fulfilled mitzvot using only his abilities and on his own and on his initiative, as opposed to being commanded by the Creator. Consequently, a person's mitzvah action could not cause the essence of the quality of the object with which he fulfilled the mitzvah to transform from its natural state into a mitzvah object. Any change in effect was limited only to the person since he was the one who had performed the action. Oh, this is so beautiful. There's a lot of nuances here that I failed to mention, which I'll mention in a minute. After Matan Torah, however, when Hashem gave the positive and negative mitzvot, a new reality emerged. Now the mitzvah act could also affect the object with which the mitzvah was performed. As a result of the Creator's commandment to humanity, a person now has the ability to transform the object with which he did the mitzvah or the sin, heaven forbid. Okay, this is a very important point. I kept on going back to the medrash of the divide, but the Rebbe is focusing on commandments. When I do something voluntarily on my own initiative, okay, that's wonderful. I should get a plaque because I mean well, I want to do it. But the point here is if I'm doing it by my own initiative, I can only do as much as my capabilities allow for. When I am commanded by Hashem, so according to the Torah's perspective, certainly the Kabbalah's perspective, a command is also empowerment. If God says do something, what he's really telling us is do it because I am bestowing upon you the power to do so. Okay, so patriarchs were much greater people than we, no question about that. But could they transform the physical material of the earth? Of course not, because the creation cannot transform anything. The only way we transform is we have the power of the creator. But we don't have the power of creator if we weren't commanded. The commandment, when God says do a mitzvah, what he's really saying is, I'm giving you the power to impose holiness and to implement holiness and to allow the holiness to permeate within the physical object. But we can't do that on our own. We can only do it as a result of the commandment, because commandment is empowerment, which is also a very Hasidic idea, right? We look at the commandment as a commandment is a burden. God says, you have to do something. Yes, it's true, commandment is a burden, but it's much more than a burden. Commandment is empowerment. If God says, you have to do this, what God is really telling you, the real takeaway is you could do this. You have the power to do this, because God would never command us to do what we cannot do, right? God wouldn't command us to go to Mars, without the technology, because we can't do it. So here's a wonderful idea. This notion that there's a big divide between before the giving of the Torah and after the giving of the Torah. Because before the Torah was given, you could do wonderful things that's going to transform myself. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were good people. And they're probably better people than I am. not probably, definitely. The mitzvot that they did refined the person. That you can do. It's you. You can refine yourself, no problem. But the mitzvah that they did cannot refine the world, because God created the world as a physical entity. You cannot change it by creation. The creation itself cannot change it. The only way we can change it is if we have the power of God. The power of God, the power of the Creator, comes along with the commandments. So when we do a mitzvah, we actually transform the physical world, which was impossible for the patriarchs. Let's read a little bit more. When a Jew fulfills a positive mitzvah, the doer is affected. That's obvious. That's what was also that was also true about the patriarchs, as well as the substance of the object with which the mitzvah was performed. The object becomes a mitzvah object, etc. And similarly, regarding a negative mitzvah, when a person transgresses, heaven forbid, the sin only affects the person. The sin not only affects the person, but also affects the object. i.e., the object changes and becomes repulsive. Okay. Now that Rebbe goes into a whole side issue, I don't think we have to read it inside. I'll give you a summary of that, and then we'll go back to Rav Yosef. Okay. What's the summary? We have 2 minutes for a summary. Okay, I'm going to try to do this in under 2 minutes. The Torah in Genesis, we read how in our Sunday classes, we'll get to it next in a few weeks, where Abraham wants Eliezer to take an oath that he's going to go and find a wife for Isaac. So he says, take an oath. Now, what do you do when you take an oath here? Here you hold the Bible. What does Abraham say? He says, put your hand under my thigh, meaning on his reproductive organ. Meaning, why? Because you need something holy. They had no Bible. So what mitzvah does he have? The only mitzvah he has is circumcision. So you have something very interesting. The only mitzvah that Abraham did after he was commanded, and he did not do before he was commanded, was circumcision. Why is that? Because the whole purpose of the mitzvah of circumcision is to affect the physical body. So to do it before you were commanded, it'd be pointless, right? It's just harming the body. So to affect the physical body, to bring the holiness into the physical body, he needed to wait for the commandments. And that's why he waited until he was commanded till 99, whereas other mitzvot he did earlier. Because circumcision is actually you can actually see how the mitzvah affects the physical flesh, but it's a representative of mitzvot affecting the physical person. But to do so, you need to be commanded. So there'll be no point of doing the circumcision before the commandment. So that's just an aside. Now we're getting back to Rav Yosef's statement. If not for this day, the fact what this day has caused, how many Josephs would there be in the marketplace? That's how he chose to highlight the importance of the day. And we asked many questions. We said, what do you mean that this day has caused? Say, if not for the Torah. No, if not for what this day has caused, and how many Josephs are there in the marketplace. So we'll start reading. And we'll see how much I can explain, how much we'll understand, and whatever we do is good because we already have the big idea. We already know. Now, if I stop you in the street and I say, what is Shavuot? You're going to say, if you say we got the Torah, it's true, but it's not the full answer. The full answer is the Shavuot, we were commanded to keep the Torah, which means we were empowered to transform the physical world. Because from here and on, when we do a mitzvah, it's not only that I develop myself, that I better myself. That's true too. That's the gavra, that's the person. But once the Torah was given, once we were commanded, now we're empowered by the Creator to actually transform the creation. And that's the big idea. And that's the purpose of creation, which was not able to be done before the Torah was given. We only had preparation before the Torah was given, which is to elevate, to refine the people so that they should be able to do this task. But they did not refine the world. They didn't. They didn't transform the world. When we do a mitzvah, you transform the physical entity, the physical substance of the world. Okay, let's go a little further. We'll see if we can get back to that full statement. And we'll see what happens. This is the meaning of Rav Yosef's statement. If not for the influence of this day, how many Yosefs are there in the marketplace? If not for the influence of this day, of Matan Torah, of the giving of the Torah, people would still learn Torah and fulfill mitzvot, as explained, right? The patriarchs did it. We may also have, if it's possible, not likely, but it's possible that if the Torah was not given, we would still be sitting here learning today Torah, because our patriarchs would pass it on to their descendants, and we would be sitting today and studying Torah. It's possible. So in other words, that's not what the Torah has done, that we study Torah. We may have done it otherwise. We may have been doing it otherwise, even if not for the day of the giving of the Torah. The general point of Torah and mitzvot, as alluded to by the name Yosef, literally addition, is to introduce holiness to worldly affairs as something supplements. However, all these contributions of Yosef in Torah and mitzvot before Matan Torah leave the world as a marketplace. The world remains as a marketplace, a public domain, unchanged, exactly as it was before the mitzvot were performed. This is beautiful. So the Rebbe is going poetic. What is Yosef? How many Josephs would there be in the marketplace? What does Yosef mean? Yosef means addition. Yosef means adding holiness. So if the Torah was not given, there may have been many people running around studying Torah, adding holiness in the world, because they're adding holiness within themselves as people. But the marketplace is still a marketplace. Marketplace is a metaphor for public domain. Private domain is the domain of God. Marketplace is just a jungle, right? Everybody's running around. Marketplace is not holiness. Holiness is the domain of the singular, not the domain of the plural. So the point here is there would be a lot of addition of holiness in the world, but there would be so many Yosefs in the marketplace. What happens now, once the Torah was given, now we could transform the marketplace. That's the big idea. Now the marketplace is no longer a marketplace. So here we go. The reason is that a mitzvah performed before Matan Torah affected only the person and not the physical world. It could not transform ordinary objects into mitzvah objects, as discussed. Specifically as a result of this day, when Hashem commanded the Jewish people to keep Torah and mitzvot, could there be Yosef, an addition and change, causing the world to no longer remain a marketplace? The addition occurred after Matan Torah, accrued after Matan Torah, through Torah study and the fulfillment of mitzvot, transformed not only the person leaving the marketplace in the same prior states, but rather the marketplace is transformed into a mitzvah object, into a holy place, etc. In other words, when we read this statement initially, we said he's saying, how many Josephs would be in the marketplace? And now I am better than those Josephs. So the emphasis, when you read it on the superficially, it was on the Joseph. The Rebbe is saying, no, the emphasis is on the marketplace. If not for this day, there would be many good deeds in the market, many good people in the marketplace. Yeah, but the marketplace would remain a marketplace. Now that the Torah was given, the marketplace could be transformed. So you know what? Pass the meat. Give us good meat. Because again, it has to find expression in the physical world, because that's the whole theme of the day, destroying and demolishing the divide between heaven and earth. Okay, I think that will be enough for this year. We'll come back next year. We'll continue the essay, God willing, in good health. But I think we have a complete concept, because we understand the essence of the day from the Kabbalistic perspective. As I mentioned, it's not, a lot of the Kabbalistic concepts are alluded to in the Medrash. So the Medrash does say this division, this idea, people of Syria not go down to Rome, but it doesn't fully elaborate and tell you what it's really saying, because at that point, the Kabbalistic knowledge was still hidden. The mystical knowledge was still hidden. It's there, it's in the book, it almost says it clearly, but we would never get to that conclusion until you get the Hasidic interpretation. Now we understand that what happened on the 6th day of Sivan, and what we re-celebrate every year, is not just the fact that now we have new information. Now we know what God wants of us. No, the patriarchs also knew what God wants of us. They weren't commanded, we're commanded. What does that mean? They were not empowered to transform the physical world. We are empowered. Every mitzvah we do, every good deed we do, we actually transform the physical world. Eventually, there'll be a tipping point where there'll be so much transformation within the world that we'll actually be able to see that the world is a holy place. And that's going to be when we reach the tipping point, when Mashiach comes, as the great prophet Isaiah says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God, like the water covers the seabed. And there's so many verses in the prophets that explain this concept. All flesh will see that the word of God, because then the transformation that we've been working at toward for the past 3,300 years will reach the tipping point, and it's going to surface. But makes no mistake about it, the transformation has been happening for the past 3,300 years. And every time we do a mitzvah, we're part of this process of transforming the marketplace. So that's the story in short. Thank you very much for joining. Have a wonderful day, wonderful holiday. Questions, comments, jokes, objections, all welcome. In good health. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Go ahead, Vicky.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's a really beautiful idea, and just in time for the holiday gives us a new inspiration. I have a question about that particular statement that we are empowered to transform physical objects. Abraham and patriarchs, I don't know how many before, were able to transfer themselves, and so do we, hopefully, right? As to physical objects, there is a power to do to make it holy, or the opposite. So I don't know if here or anywhere else we can also transform ourselves and relationships. I mean, the meat food is example of how you transform the actually the object is transformed or holy and unholy. But as far as the human relationship, because that's also going to affect how soon we're going to reach the point where we tip the scale, which we're all waiting for.
But here's the premise of the argument. The premise of the point here, I think, is that I ask you, what's more difficult, to change something that is spiritual or change something that is physical? So the whole realm of human consciousness and human psychology is spiritual in some sense, right? It's not physical. When I change my heart from being cruel to being kind, right? It's not a physical transformation. It's a spiritual transformation. So the argument is that a person with spiritual knowledge and spiritual sensitivity could spiritually refine themselves. That's not a problem. That's not radical. What's radical is that you can write a few words on a piece of parchment and the parchment becomes holy. That's radical. To believe that we have an effect, we don't see it yet. Today, it's still belief, it's still mysticism. But essentially, when Mashiach comes, we will be able to see what we accomplished. And what we accomplished is that the physical world is transformed. It's not the same object. That's why even in Jewish law, there's certain things you cannot do with an object of a mitzvah. You can't do it. You can't throw it out. You can't discard it because it has been transformed. So the point here is that's much more radical. To say that with the power of spirituality, you can actually change not only my psyche, which is a spiritual concept, but you can actually change the materialism of the world. That is radical, and that a creation cannot do because God created the divide, and God created the physical world in a certain sense, in a certain state. How can I change it? That is beyond the power of me to change something physical with a spiritual idea. But here we're saying that no, God commands us, and commandments, even though we were trained to think that commandment and superficially commandment is imposing a burden, but in reality, in the Kabbalistic interpretation, a commandment is an empowerment. Because like I said, if I don't have the power to do it, there'll be no commandment. And if I'm commanded, it means I have the power to do it. And if I had no power to do it before the commandments, but the commandment empowers me, then commandment is empowerment. So now we're empowered to have the energy of God, the power of God, the creative power of God, to be able to actually recreate or retransform or transform the physical to the spiritual. And that is the celebration. And that's why, there's no way you can celebrate this with studying Torah. You have to celebrate it or fasting. You have to celebrate this by eating good food, because that's the whole point of the day. Could you imagine we're celebrating the power to transform the world by remaining in the state of ideas? You're before the giving of a Torah. You missed the boat. You missed the point of the celebration.
So what you're saying is the relationship is a realm of spiritual still. So the patriarchs were able to transform. But
they themselves, we studied Tanya last Friday. We said that they're Merkava, they're a chariot. They could transform themselves to the point where they have no independent will. They're completely nullified to the divine will. That's all fine. It's all within the self. Within the self, their personality, their spiritual personality is refined, but not the physical flesh. When you do a mitzvah with your physical hand, the physical flesh now becomes holy. In Abraham's case, the circumcision, he could not do a circumcision alone because, he would just remove the skin, but that's not the point. It would not become a holy object because the holy object would only becomes once there's a commandment.
Is there any other example we can think of using that power for the bad instead of other than food? Well, writing something that's not kosher.
I think in some ways, there's a lot of mitzvot that I guess a lot of it is food, and a lot of it is a lot of the practical mitzvot are food. but it's not only food. Let's say an idol. We're studying in Maimonides, we're studying the laws of idol worship. The law of idol worship is that if someone creates an idol, the idol has to be destroyed. Now, how it's destroyed is a different question. Is it enough? You have to obliterate it completely. The idol worshiper could nullify it by making a small change. There's all kinds of laws. But at some point, you're going to say this substance is not just something used for unholiness, but this substance is unholy. So it needs to be reformed. How to reform it is a good question. There's different ways. The Jew, Gentile, idol worshiper himself has to nullify it without getting into the point. The point is, some things we say, this thing is out of bounds. We say, why not? I'll bring it home. It was used as an idol. I'll bring it home. Be a nice decoration. It will inspire people to become closer to God. It's a wonderful thing. No, it doesn't work that way, because there is within this object, there is unholiness in the physicality, in the physical space, in the physical material of this object, until you reverse that trend by doing what the halacha would say. There's different things you can do to nullify it, but before you do so, this object is problematic.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, there is a whole array of objects you can think of.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
my question is, first, thanks. This was really, your session was enlightening.
Thank you.
You gave me a different perspective on myself, because if I perform mitzvahs, according to what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, if I perform mitzvahs, then I am elevating myself as a person in doing so.
Yes, but two parts. First of all, you're elevating the spiritual part of self, your own psyche, your own feelings, your own emotions, your personality, what they would call personal growth.
Yes.
But that is true even if the Torah was not been given. That's true. Abraham was a kind person. That's true. What we're saying, once the Torah was given, is you also have the power to transform the physical reality of the world, including the physical reality of your own physical body. Because when you do a mitzvah with your arm or with your leg, when you're going to go help somebody, or you're going to walk to do a mitzvah, what's happening here is some of that holiness is being permeated within the physical flesh. So it's not just you transforming your soul or your personality, which is a spiritual thing. It's actually penetrating the physical object as well, which, by the way, ties into the notion of it's not the only reason, but why we honor a dead body, right? We say, what's a body? A body is just a tool. The person's dead. It's really the soul. Who cares about the body? Discard the body. No. In Judaism, we have tremendous respect for the body, even though it doesn't serve any function. One of the reasons is because what is the body? The body, after so many years of hosting the soul and doing good deeds, the body itself becomes a holy object. And just like you wouldn't discard a Torah scroll, you're not going to discard a body.
Understood. So then, if I